Hey Gladiators, welcome to Lesson 4 of Unit 1A, where we're going to talk about some documents that were really influential to the creation of the United States. In this lesson, you should be able to identify which influential documents created different ideals that are important to the United States. Our first document is going to be the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta limited the government. It created the idea of rule of law, the idea of due process, and the idea of property rights, or that we actually get to own property that is not the government's to take away. So these are all of some big ideas within the Magna Carta, and we're going to talk more about what each one of these ideas means later on in the lesson. So way back in the Middle Ages, England was ruled by this king who shared some of his power with the wealthy nobility. So basically kind of the higher up, really wealthy people. The nobility would carry out the king's wishes, and the king would allow the nobles to make some local decisions. So they would actually get to make decisions on their own land, kind of like how teachers get to make decisions within their own classrooms. By the early 1200s, though, King John was trying to take all of the power for himself. He was taxing the nobility a whole lot extra because he wanted to both make himself richer, but he also wanted to fund wars that he wanted to go wage. The angry nobles fought back, and in 1215 they created this document called the Magna Carta, which means the Great Charter. This document limited the power of the king and protected certain rights for the nobles. The nobility was powerful enough to force King John to sign the Magna Carta, and they really did have to force him. He did not want to sign this. He didn't want to just give up his power. They had to force him to do this. This was a really big deal because it introduced some of those some of those big ideas that we just talked about. So let's go in and actually look at what some of those ideals mean. So the first is this idea of limited government. Limited government is where the leaders in government, or even the government itself, are restricted in their authority and power. The government has boundaries, things they cannot do, so that our rights are protected. And so this helps to protect our freedoms and our rights. Next is the idea of due process, or that we all get fair treatment through the judicial system, that no matter who you are, whether you are a part of the government, or whether you have money, whether you are powerful or not, that you are going to be treated fairly in legal matters. Finally, for the Magna Carta, we have the idea of rule of law, or the idea that everybody, no matter how powerful they are, just kind of like with due process, no matter how powerful they are, that all people must follow the law, that all people must follow the rules. Our second document is the Petition of Right. And the Petition of Right has several big ideas that you need to make sure that you get down in your notes. The first is the idea that there are going to be no taxes without the nobles saying that it's okay. So again, the king was trying to tax too heavily. Number 2, no one can be put in prison without a reason, not just because the king doesn't like them. They have to have actually broken a law. Number 3, no soldiers can be placed in citizens' homes without their permission. And number 4, no military rule if we are not at war. So basically, the king can't just use the military willy-nilly to do what he wants at home. The military is specifically to go to war. So about 400 years after the Magna Carta, a new king of England, because, hundreds of years have gone by, and memories get kind of fuzzy after a couple hundred years. So there's a new king of England, and who is King Charles I, and he decided that he needed more power again from the nobles. Since the nobles had gotten used to having the power from the Magna Carta, they didn't want to give those freedoms up. They didn't want to give those rights up. So the nobles sent a declaration to King Charles I in 1628 that forced him to give up some of his power. And again, this was a big deal. They kind of had to force him to do it because the king didn't want to let go of power. Except this time, the nobles forced him to give up even more power than they had forced King John to give up in the Magna Carta. So the big definition you need to get out of this document is the idea of individual liberties. Now, when we say the word liberty, you need to make sure that you know that liberty means freedom. And so the idea of individual liberties is that every person has rights and freedoms that can't be taken away from them, no matter what the government wants to do, unless it is through due process, through a fair judicial process. And some of those freedoms that we think of right off the top of our head are life, liberty, and property. And so we'll talk more about those in our next lesson. Our final document is the English Bill of Rights. And the English Bill of Rights is where we actually get a lot of the ideas for our Bill of Rights, which we're going to learn about later in the class. Some big ideas: that there are free elections to Parliament, so the king can't interfere in elections in Parliament. That people have the right to bear arms or to have weaponry in order to protect themselves. The right to petition the government or to ask the government to make changes. The right to a fair trial, so again, due process, no cruel or unusual punishments, and no excessive fines or bail. And we're going to talk more about those later in the course. So since 1628, when the Petition of Right was signed, Parliament had been battling it out with the king in a series of civil wars. Parliament eventually came out on top and passed the English Bill of Rights in 1689. Like the Magna Carta and the Petition of Right, this document limited the powers of the English king and gave more power to the people in the nobility. This document was well known because it affected people living in Britain, but it also affected the new British colonies in the Americas. In this lesson, you should have learned to identify which influential documents created different ideals that are important to American government. If there's anything you missed in your notes, go back now to that part of the video and rewatch it.